Emily Harrington was the youngest judge ever appointed in the courthouse of the small town of Greenbrook. She had earned a reputation for being tough, fair, and always in control. Emily had been invited to a private party, hosted by an old friend, and Emily, feeling the weight of a long week in court, decided she'd go. As usual, her bodyguard, Officer Joe Carson, was there, waiting just outside her office at the courthouse. Joe was a dedicated cop, quiet and unassuming, with a sharp mind and a keen sense of duty. He had been assigned to Emily just a few months back, a precautionary measure after some unsettling cases she'd handled. His job was to protect her wherever she went, and he took that responsibility seriously. When Emily walked out of her office that evening, ready to leave, Joe stepped forward and asked, "Good evening, Judge Harrington. Do you have any plans tonight?" Emily paused. She knew Joe would insist on following her to the party if he thought she was going anywhere, but she didn't want him there. This was her night to relax, and she didn't need the watchful eyes of her guard shadowing her every move. "No, Joe," she replied with a small smile. "Nothing tonight. Just heading home to rest. You can go home too." Joe hesitated, glancing at her with a look of mild concern. He knew it wasn't typical for Emily to dismiss him, especially since she was usually particular about security. But she was his boss, and he couldn't argue with her. "Well, if you're sure, Judge," he replied slowly, sensing something was off but unable to put his finger on it. "I'm sure, Joe. It's been a long week," she said, her tone light but firm. "Go on, enjoy your evening. I'll be fine." After a final nod, Joe left, though he decided he wouldn't head home just yet. Instead, he made it a routine patrol, driving around the neighborhood in his cruiser, keeping an eye out for any disturbances. Little did he know, that decision would prove to be more important than he could have imagined. Meanwhile, Emily slipped into her own car, feeling a strange mix of freedom and excitement. She drove off toward the house where the party was being held, eager to unwind and put work aside, if only for a few hours. The party was everything she'd hoped for, lively, full of familiar faces, and most importantly, far away from the courthouse. The music was loud, and the drinks flowed freely. Emily allowed herself to relax completely, laughing and chatting with friends she hadn't seen in ages. She lost track of time, letting the hours slip by as she enjoyed herself more than she had in a long time. But as the night wore on, Emily had one drink too many. The effects of the alcohol began to hit her harder than expected. Her laughter grew louder, her steps more unsteady, and her friends started to worry. "You sure you're okay to drive, Emily?" one of them asked as she wobbled toward her car. "I'm fine, just fine," she insisted, brushing off their concerns with a wave of her hand. She felt like she could handle it. After all, she was the judge of Greenbrook. If she couldn't make her own decisions, who could? With a grin, she slipped into her car and started the engine, unaware of just how unsteady her hands were on the wheel. She barely noticed the dim street lights or the empty roads as she drove through town, focusing only on getting home. But a few blocks from the party, headlights flashed in her rearview mirror. Blue and red lights. The sound of a siren cut through the still night air. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she slowed down and pulled over. Who was stopping her at this hour? It was so late, and she hadn't seen any other cars around. She waited, feeling a mix of dread and confusion. The officer stepped out of the cruiser and walked over to her window. Emily's eyes went wide as she recognized him. It was Joe, her own bodyguard. "Judge Harrington?" he said, his voice steady, though she could see the shock in his face. "Joe! It's me, Emily!" she exclaimed, a grin breaking out on her face. "You don't need to pull me over. I'm just going home." But Joe's face didn't change. He looked at her seriously, a hint of sadness in his eyes as he replied, "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. Please step out of the vehicle." Emily's smile faded as reality hit her. Joe wasn't here as her bodyguard tonight. He was here as an officer of the law. And tonight she wasn't just Judge Emily Harrington, she was a citizen who'd broken the rules. As she stepped out of the car, her mind whirled, wondering what would happen next, her world spinning in ways she hadn't anticipated. This night was far from over. Emily stumbled as she stepped out of the car, gripping the door for support. The cold night air hit her, clearing her mind just enough to realize how serious this was. Joe stood before her, his face expressionless, though she could sense the conflict in his eyes. "Joe, come on," she whispered, trying to sound casual. "It's me, Emily. You don't have to do this. We can just pretend this never happened, right?" She attempted a smile, but her words slurred, and her breath carried the sharp scent of alcohol. But Joe's gaze didn't soften. He shook his head, his hand steady on the flashlight he held. "Judge Harrington, you know I can't just look the other way. Tonight, I'm here as an officer. I'm going to need you to take a breathalyzer test." Emily stared at him, her mind racing for a way out. She couldn't believe this was happening. She was Judge Harrington. People looked up to her, counted on her. And now, here she was, caught by her own bodyguard on a night she thought would be her secret escape. "Joe," she whispered again, her voice pleading. "I'm just trying to get home. I promise I'll be fine. No one needs to know." But Joe's expression remained firm. "Ma'am, please cooperate. You know this is the law." His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the resolve in his words. Seeing no other option, Emily reluctantly agreed. She took the breathalyzer test, her hands shaking as she did. The result was clear: she was well over the legal limit. A wave of panic swept over her as she realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a traffic stop, this was a career-altering mistake, and there was no easy way out. Joe stepped back and radioed for backup. Within minutes, another police cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing in the empty street. Emily felt the sting of shame prick at her eyes as two more officers approached. One of them was Officer Mayfield, someone she'd seen often at the courthouse, a young cop with a strict sense of duty. "Evening, Judge Harrington," Officer Mayfield said, nodding politely though his face was tight with professionalism. He glanced at Joe, who gave him a brief, silent nod. "Please sit in the cruiser, ma'am," Mayfield continued, gesturing toward the back seat. "We'll take you to the station for processing." Emily opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. She felt utterly defeated, and the reality of her situation weighed heavily on her shoulders. Slowly, she walked toward the cruiser and climbed in, the door clicking shut behind her. She caught a glimpse of herself in the rearview mirror, her face pale, eyes wide with shock. As the cruiser pulled away, she looked back to see Joe getting into her car. He would be the one to drive it home, ensuring her car was parked safely in her driveway. It was the final twist of irony, watching her own bodyguard handle her car as if she were just any other lawbreaker in town. The ride to the station was a blur. Emily barely registered the hum of the engine or the quiet chatter of the officers up front. Her thoughts spiraled, replaying every moment of the night, every choice she'd made that had led her to this point. She could hardly believe how quickly her life had changed in the space of a few hours. At the station, she went through the standard procedures, feeling more humiliated with each step. Her fingerprints were taken, her belongings placed in a small plastic bag, and she was led to a holding cell. The officer who locked the door gave her a sympathetic look, but he didn't say a word. As the hours crept by, Emily felt the cold bite of reality sink in. She was no longer Judge Harrington in this cell, she was just another person who'd made a mistake, facing the consequences of her actions. She thought about Joe, about the duty he'd chosen over loyalty, and a pang of sadness mingled with the shame. He'd done the right thing, she realized, even though it must have been difficult for him. The night passed slowly, and Emily barely slept. The uncomfortable bench offered no comfort, and the humiliation gnawed at her. She was a public figure, everyone would know about this by morning. And her career, what would become of her career? When dawn finally broke, she was taken to a private room and allowed to make a phone call. She considered calling her family, but the thought of explaining this to them was too much to bear. Instead, she dialed her lawyer, John Tate, who listened patiently as she explained the situation, his voice calm but serious as he promised to come to her aid. By Monday morning, Emily was led into the courtroom. But this time, she wasn't the one in the judge's seat. She was the defendant, facing the gaze of everyone she had once presided over. Another judge, a stern-looking man with gray hair and a steady gaze, sat at the bench. Emily swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their collective judgment. As the judge read out the charges, driving under the influence, reckless endangerment, Emily felt her face flush. She couldn't look anyone in the eye, her shame too overwhelming. When the time came for Joe to testify, he stood up straight, his uniform neat, his face expressionless. He spoke clearly, detailing the events of that night with professionalism and respect. He didn't embellish or downplay anything, just presented the facts as they were. Finally, the judge gave his verdict. Emily held her breath, bracing herself. Emily's heart pounded as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence. She had never felt so vulnerable, so completely at the mercy of someone else's judgment. She'd been on the other side of this bench countless times, but now, everything felt different. "Judge Harrington," the presiding judge began, his voice firm yet calm. "You have spent years upholding the law, guiding others to make better choices and holding them accountable when they did not. Tonight you stand here because, like any other person, you are responsible for your actions." Emily held her breath, her gaze fixed on her folded hands. The courtroom was silent, every eye on her. Driving under the influence is not just a mistake. It's a choice that endangers lives, the judge continued. As a judge, you should be held to the highest standard, and it is essential that the law be applied equally to everyone, regardless of position. She felt a mixture of shame and acceptance. Deep down, she knew this was fair. She had crossed the line and was now facing the very system she had dedicated her life to uphold. Therefore, the judge declared, his voice steady, "You are hereby sentenced to 3 months in jail, to be served on weekends. Additionally, you will complete 100 hours of community service, which I am assigning to be done here at the courthouse under the supervision of your peers." Emily's head shot up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Working community service at the courthouse? She would have to face her colleagues, her staff, everyone who had looked up to her. She swallowed hard, managing a slight nod. It was humiliating, but she knew it was a fitting consequence. Perhaps it was even just. The judge wrapped up his final remarks, and Emily's lawyer gently patted her shoulder as she was escorted out of the courtroom. A week later, Emily reported to the courthouse for her first day of community service. She was dressed in plain clothes, a far cry from her usual professional attire, and she carried a cleaning supply cart down the very hallways where she'd once walked with authority. She kept her eyes down, avoiding the sympathetic or judgmental looks from colleagues who passed by. Her assignment was to clean the courthouse lobby, a task she once thought mundane and unnoticed. But today, every swipe of her mop, every scrub of the floors reminded her of why she was here. She remembered her bodyguard Joe's calm words that night. "I'm just doing my job." He had followed his duty, as she should have. As she worked, people she knew would occasionally pass by. Some offered polite nods, others simply looked away. But a few approached her, exchanging quiet words of encouragement. "It takes strength to face this," one clerk said with a small smile. "You'll come through it." Days turned to weeks, and gradually, Emily found herself reflecting deeply on her choices. She had always prided herself on her ability to judge right from wrong, to enforce the law impartially. But now she understood, in a way she hadn't before, that even the best of us could fall. And it wasn't the fall that defined us, but the choice to stand back up. By the time her last weekend in jail rolled around, Emily had learned to embrace the humility of her situation. She had paid her debt and taken the punishment with grace, even if it had been painful. The community service hours brought her closer to the people of Greenbrook, and it wasn't long before people's judgment turned to quiet respect for how she'd faced the consequences. On her last day of community service, as she was putting away her cleaning supplies, she noticed Joe standing by the door, watching her. She hadn't seen him since that night. Their eyes met, and he gave her a nod, his expression softening. "Joe," she said, walking over to him. "Thank you for what you did." He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You're welcome, Judge. Just doing my job." She returned the smile, appreciating the unspoken understanding between them. Joe had stayed true to his duty, and because of that, she'd found her way back to hers. As she left the courthouse that evening, Emily felt a newfound strength. Her reputation had been shaken, but not broken. The town had seen her fall, yes, but they'd also seen her rise again, humbled yet unwavering. And as for Joe, he continued his duty as a police officer, knowing that his loyalty to the law had not only preserved justice but had also restored a judge's integrity. This brings us to the end of this story. Thank you for watching the video to the end. Kindly subscribe for more thrilling stories. Like and share this video. Have a nice day.